Basta na. Relax lang. Ablasa day philosophers. This is our group's pre-lecture repetitio of Father Jacques Martin's A Preface to Metaphysics. And thus, this is our thesis statement. The principle, a being is what it is, seems obvious and trivial at first, but it has deep metaphysical meaning. It shows that every being has its own stable identity. And because of that, beings can be different from one another. This principle helps the metaphysician understand both the unity within each thing and the real diversity in the world.
So, for the first supporting point, Martin explains that common sense uses the principle of identity unreflectively. For example, a cat is a cat, but the metaphysicians perceive it as expressing the primal mystery of being, its self-subsistence and intelligible abundance.
So for the second supporting points, the principle of identity safeguards multiplicity. If each being is what it is, then it is not what another being is identity. Therefore, protects diversity rather than dissolving everything into sameness.
For the third supporting point, identity is grasped analogically, not univocally. The intuition of being sees that being is realized in many distinct ways. The principle of identity applies to all beings but does not homogenize them because it respects their different essences.
So, for the first objection, if a being is what it is simply repeats the same term, it seems like an empty tautology with no metaphysical depth, just a verbal repetition.
So for the second objection, if the principle of identity protects diversity, why does it also lack reality into rigid isolation, making relations or interactions between beings unintelligible?
For the third objection, the principle applies to all beings analogically, and one might argue that analogical use weakens the principle's universality, making it vague instead of foundational.
So, to the answer of the first objection, the principle appears tautology only at the level of language. Metaphysically, it expresses that every being has an intelligible structure grounding its existence. It is not the verbal repetition that matters, but the reality revealed. A being is self-identical because it possesses the act of being that makes it this being and not another.
So to answer the second objection, identity does not isolate being. Rather, it ensures that each being can be recognized as a distinct subject of relations. Real diversity is possible only because each being is stable in what it is. Without identity, no real difference or interactions could be intelligible.
And to answer the third objection, analogy does not weaken universality, it refines it. The principle of identity applies universally because all beings possess identity, but analogy recognizes that each being possesses identity according to its own mode of existence. The principle is universal in scope and diverse in application.
So, to illustrate our first supporting point, a triangle and a tree are both, they are what they are, but entirely different ways. Their identity reveals their essence, not their linguistic label. The principle point to their intelligible, not the sameness of terms.
So to give the second illustration, water can interact with fire precisely because each has its own identity, its own stable nature. If water, not truly water, the relation of a distinguished fire would have no grounding on reality.
And lastly, to illustrate our first supporting point, human identity and angelic identity are both identities, but they are not identical in content. The same principle holds for both, yet each realizes it differently. Analogy preserves the universality while respecting differences.
So, for our first insight, the metaphysical power of the principle lies in revealing that intelligibility is rooted in being itself. It is not a logical invention, but a discovery of how reality is structured.
For our second insight, identity is a very condition that allows being to stand in relation to diversity, is meaningful only when each diverse being is grounded in its own proper identity.
And lastly, our third insight, analogy is not a weakening but a strengthening of metaphysical thought. It allows us to affirm unity without erasing difference and to affirm diversity without fracturing intelligibility.
So, to conclude, the principle a being is what it is may seem trivial to ordinary thought, but for metaphysics, it expressed the fundamental intelligibility of reality.
It reveals the self-grounded unity of each being, while simultaneously securing the genuine diversity of all beings.
Far from being a mere tautology, it is a metaphysical law that illuminates why reality is both coherent and manifold, which unified in its foundations, yet infinitely varied in its realizations. Thus, this ends our lectio repetitio. Thank you.